Welcome to the Regulation Podcast, brought to you by the Institute of Regulation. Once again, we hope this podcast will help you understand more about regulation and, of course, why it increasingly matters to the public. My name is Anthony Oliver, and today's discussion will try to unpack the complex relationship between regulation and government, and in particular explain and explore how improving one can boost outcomes for the other. Now, to help me with this meaty challenge, my guest today is Matthew Gill, Programme Director at the Institute for Government and something of an expert in both regulation and the workings of government. Most recently, Matthew joined the Institute of Regulation as a Director and a Trustee, where no doubt he will be working hard to champion and I hope to challenge the role of regulators. So, let's make a start on this tricky issue of better regulation for better government. And perhaps while we're at it, we might also get Matthew's views on what the regulation sector might expect from this general election year in terms of likely change coming down the track from a new or perhaps refocused administration. So welcome, Matthew. Thanks for joining me on the Regulation Podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
Great. Well, Matthew, as I explained, you are Programme Director at the Institute for Government, an organisation with a mission to make UK government more effective through rigorous research, open discussion and fresh thinking. You lead work on public bodies, so how would you describe your current role? What do you actually do?
Well, I work on areas that are relatively new for the Institute for Government. So at the moment, I'm focusing on building out our research base. We produce research reports, but we also engage in a range of activities to maximise the impact of our ideas, including hosting private roundtables, organising public events, and seeking to influence decision makers behind the scenes.
All right. Well, in my intro, I referenced the complex relationship between regulation and the government, and I noticed how improving one can help to improve the outcomes for the other. I mean, from your work in this area, did I get that right? I mean, how does your work at the IFG help this relationship to blossom and to bloom?
Well, the Institute's been around since 2008, and it focuses mainly on central government, with some exceptions around public services and devolution. My work focuses on public bodies and on regulators, so those parts of government that are arm's length, so further away from the centre. And that means I have a particular interest in the relationship between central government and the organisations it controls or delivers through. And as part of that work, we've looked at these organisations' roles in the crisis response post-COVID. We've looked at public appointments of those who lead them, why those bodies exist, and the lessons you can learn from different points of their life cycle. So how they should be established, and indeed how they should be abolished when that's appropriate. A lot of that work is relevant to regulation because most regulators are public bodies. But we're now also building a programme of work on regulation specifically, and we'll start by looking at parliamentary oversight of regulators and how that might be improved. Okay,
well, perhaps we'll talk a bit more about some ongoing work in that field a bit later on. But I also mentioned that you've been recently appointed as a director of the Institute of Regulation, and I'm keen to get your views on how the Institute can really help the sector. But on a high level, I mean, how would you say that the government experts like yourself, can work to boost standards in the regulation profession?
Well, most directly, government sets the remit and legal powers of most regulators, but it also sets many of their funding envelopes, as well as the broad expectations of the regulatory landscape, including the wider aspects of government policy to which regulators should have regard in their work. And so a mutual understanding between government and regulators is essential to make that work, so that the right parameters are set and responded to in the right way. And if we can make that relationship work better, then we'll get better regulation.
Right. I mean, that's the ultimate question. Can better regulation really make for better government?
Absolutely, it can, because regulators deliver on government priorities, like food that's safe to eat or markets that are competitive and innovative. And some regulators even regulate government's own activities. So Ofsted in education or the CQC in care, and they regulate public bodies, like Ofcom regulates the BBC.
Well, before we delve in a bit more to talk a bit about how the Institute Institute of Regulation can help. Let's talk a bit about the ongoing parliamentary inquiries that are actually happening into regulation right now. Particularly the House of Lords Industry and Regulators Committees. There's a number of ongoing inquiries into issues relating to the regulation sector. Into water, for instance, and students, for example. But most recently, it launched an inquiry specifically into UK regulators with a focus on their roles, their remit, independence and accountability. I suppose the obvious question is, why is this work necessary?
Well, I think there's an interest among parliamentarians at the moment in regulatory accountability, particularly post-Brexit, when EU institutions are no longer holding regulators to account in the same way in some areas, and so there's a concern about how we're going to do that domestically. But aside from that Brexit angle, parliamentarians are perennially concerned about the exercise of power by others in the sort of government arena,
right, yeah.
Particularly when those parliamentarians can be accountable for the decisions that those people make. For instance, when we had the failure of energy suppliers a couple of years ago, that was never only going to be an issue for Ofgem, the regulator, but it was also going to be an issue for ministers and Parliament. So this is always an area of interest for them. I think practically for the Industry and Regulators Committee at the moment, also, the committee membership is rotating at the end of January. So this is the end of their term, and they're wanting to put together a report that draws together their broad conclusions on the subject before they move on.
Right, yeah. The committee's started its work, and it's taken evidence from a number of organisations, the National Infrastructure Commission, the Competition and Markets Authority, for example. It's going to examine, amongst other things, whether regulators as a whole have been given a clear job to do and whether their roles and remits are sufficiently discrete from one another. Is that the problem that how you would describe the problem that the Lords are looking into?
Yeah, they've consulted quite widely, and both the Institute of Regulation and the Institute for Government have also submitted evidence to them. I think their questions, which are quite broad, can be grouped under three headings. One would be objectives and independence. Do regulators have the right strategic direction? Another would be performance and cooperation and overlap between regulators. Are they set up well and doing well? And the third will be accountability. Who regulates the regulators, if you like? Right,
yeah. And this issue of being appropriately independent of government and getting that right balance between strategic and political input from government. Why would you say, in your words, why is that independence so important? And perhaps more importantly, do you agree it's under threat?
Well, to take those in turn, independence matters because, regulatory judgments are often technically complex and require specialists to make them, and managing a regulatory process is also complex and requires specialist expertise. And ministers don't have the bandwidth and aren't necessarily qualified to do that. So it needs to be delegated to people who can. It's also important in regulation that there's a consistent approach taken over time. For example, if you're trying to promote investment in utilities or transport infrastructure, there needs to be predictability as to what the rules of the game are beyond the political cycle. And independence is also important on grounds of propriety. Particularly where regulators are regulating government themselves, there'd be a conflict of interest if this was under direct ministerial control. Now, is independence under threat? It's always under potential threat in a democracy, because that long-term predictable approach doesn't always align with the political cycle. And so you can imagine that there are incentives to underinvest, for instance, in this parliament to keep bills down, whereas over a long time you might want to invest in infrastructure, and that can be in tension, as we've seen recently in the water sector. And you also don't always see the value of good regulation until you see the consequences of not having had it. So the Grenfell Tower example, where we realise that building cladding regulations are really important, but for some considerable time you can not notice that until something goes gradually wrong. So there's always a risk that government's incentivized to cut budgets to regulators to invest elsewhere or to reduce red tape. And that looks like a good decision until suddenly it really doesn't look like a good decision. Yeah.
Now, the final thing, of course, that you mentioned there is around accountability for this performance, for their performance, the performance of regulators. But why is this so necessary. And I suppose the question when is looking about who should be holding who to account.
Well, regulators' license to operate depends on Parliament and ministers being confident in them. And so the fact that Parliament and ministers, as our democratic representatives, are concerned about regulatory accountability is reason enough to make it important for this inquiry to look at it. There are a range of accountability mechanisms, both to ministers, to Parliament, to the NAO, to other bodies as well, that help to hold regulators to account. And I think it's not so much that you need to add to that range of oversight mechanisms, but I think the priority is really clear lines of accountability so that everybody knows which decisions are for them and which decisions are not for them, and that they have resources to deliver against their responsibilities, but can also be held fairly and clearly responsible when things go wrong.
Okay, well, we're going to talk a bit later about some of the issues, some of the initiatives that are already going on. But what might we expect this particular House of Lords work to recommend?
I mean, it's a very broad inquiry, and I don't have privileged insight into what they're going to conclude. I mean, I think what would be really helpful for them to do would be to precisely articulate the reasoning behind their own concerns. Right, okay. What is it that worries them about independence, about performance and accountability, and what's the evidence for that? And do they think that those issues are systematic, or do they think they're idiosyncratic and case specific? And if they think they're systematic, why do they think that? So that then it can be addressed. On parliamentary scrutiny specifically, I think it would be good for their recommendations to be realistic about the bandwidth of parliamentarians to engage in proactive scrutiny of regulators, as distinct from just responding when there's a crisis. Actually, the sort of forward-looking oversight is important. And if Parliament can't do that or doesn't have the interest day to day in doing that, who else would they trust to do it? And that's a key theme of our upcoming research in this area, actually. If the appetite for oversight by Parliament exceeds the capacity to actually deliver that oversight, what do you do?
It's certainly interesting times, and certainly there's an awful lot of both parties as we move towards the general election are talking about reforming regulations. So very interesting times ahead. Let's talk a bit about you, Matthew, and your background. Before joining the Institute for Government, you were in the banking sector as a policy director at the British Business Bank for over 5 years, which you helped set up while you were at HM Treasury. Before that, you were at the Financial Services Authority and the Bank of England following the financial crisis. So it sounds like you've been at the sharp end of regulation. I mean, what did that teach you?
Well, I was doing policy work in those organisations. So a lot of what I learned was about how to formulate complex information for decision, often under difficult circumstances, you say, be that caused by the financial crisis, by Brexit, by the pandemic. I also learned specifically at the FSA that when you're designing rules and guidance, the reasoning behind them needs to be readily explainable to those who are being subject to it, so those who are regulated. And also that you need to build consensus across an organisation as to those rules and guidance, particularly amongst those who are going to be enforcing them. Just winning a one-off argument that this should be the way we should do things isn't enough, because if people disagree with you, or if it's not going to land with the regulated population, it will be unpicked later on. I think I also learned it's really important to think about the cumulative impact of policy on behaviour. If you keep adding to the rule book and making rules more and more prescriptive and complex, you change the behaviour of people who interact with them. And again, in the financial services example, you encourage them to think about what do the rules say, rather than how do I think about the risks or the factors that need to be taken into account myself. Right, yeah. And that was particularly an issue in some of our work on stress testing after the financial crisis, where what you were trying to do was to encourage firms to think about the risk to their own business rather than just to model the stress that we had given them. So thinking about the impact of the rules on behaviour is really important.
Okay. I mean, you started your career at PwC as a chartered accountant. Well, is that a good background for a career in regulation? What makes a good background for a career in regulation?
Well, I mean, there are many different roles under the umbrella of regulation, including supervision and enforcement, as well as the kind of policy analysis that I've been doing. I think my time as an auditor at PwC is the closest I've personally been to a supervisory role, and that was a very valuable grounding for me in terms of understanding how that environment works. In terms of what's really driven my kind of sustained interest in this area, I would say it's a period after I was at PwC where I stepped back and did some academic analysis of the accounting profession as a sociologist, and I published a book called Accountant's Truth in 2009. And the process of doing that led me to find apparently technical processes and organizational structures fascinating at a human level. So I was studying where are the people in these processes and how do they interact with them. And so that has made these organizations and these activities very, very interesting to me. And I guess since then, I've always tried to step back from the day-to-day of what's being done and to ask, well, what is the problem that this regulation is trying to solve? And what is going to be the human reality of this solution as it's implemented, and how people are going to react to that?
Yeah, no, because it is a fascinating area in that there is a lot of rigor. There's a lot of, actually the nuts and bolts of meeting the rules and regulations. But there's also a human element to it, a really big human element. It's about people, and it's about getting the best out of people, I suppose. So you're a director now of the Institute of Regulation. What can this background, your background, bring to the role of really trying to help the world of regulation to improve?
Well, a key aspect of what the Institute of Regulation will be trying to do is to build a professional community. And again, in my research on accounting, I found that is a key means by which standards of behaviour, best practice are shared and reinforced across organisational boundaries, whereas otherwise you might have groupthink within an organisation. If you've got a wider peer group, then you can reinforce the right behaviours across that broader canvas. And I think in that context, it's really important that the Institute of Regulation is not just for representatives of the organisations or leaders of organisations, but it's for regulators working at all levels and in all functions. And so we have a range of special interest groups on enforcement, on risk, on legal, on policy, and so on. So that focus on the importance of a professional community is something I guess I want to bring to the organisation. And I also bring a little bit of distance. I'm the only person on the board who is an ex-regulator who sort of is now studying regulation. And so that gives me a different angle, as well as we've discussed already, that perspective on how regulators and government interact. So having seen that interaction from all sides, I hope I can help the Institute to articulate regulatory issues to government in a way that enables the regulatory profession to be listened to, in a way that can be quite hard for individual regulators interacting with government as organisations.
Perhaps telling them the hard truths that they don't necessarily want to admit to. You could argue that there is something of a failure in public and political confidence in regulation, or perhaps some parts of regulation, anyway, education, energy, social care, to name a few where high-profile failures. It has raised concerns that have hit the headlines. Would you agree with that? And how would the IOR perhaps help to build that confidence?
It's always difficult when something goes wrong to look back and say, well, how could that have been different? And there'll be specific lessons to learn from all of those. It's possible, but not at all certain, that a strong regulatory peer group of the kind the Institute of Regulation is trying to create might have helped. For instance, if energy regulators had been interacting informally with prudential regulators and thinking about those kinds of issues ahead of the collapse of firms in the energy sector, or if in education there'd been an active peer discussion about different styles of regulation and what the impact of those might be on people regulated. But that's complete speculation, and each example will be different. I think what the Institute can also do is step back as well and say that it's not always a regulatory failure when things go wrong. It is the nature of regulation that you're trying to prevent harms. You don't prevent all of them, and you always have to iterate and adapt your approach.
But I suppose it's becoming the world is becoming more complex. The interactions between all these different public services are becoming more complex, and there's an awful lot more pressure because the lack of the public funding is there. I mean, is the role of the IOR actually to improve that relationship with government and the public, or is it simply about training professionals better and giving them new thinking about what they're actually trying to achieve?
We're putting a lot of effort into our professional development offer, and that's valuable, in and of itself. So we have a training offer, special interest groups, our annual conference, member seminars. All of that work is valuable in terms of building that regulatory community. It's also helpful to government to be able to see the profession as a credible and trustworthy voice on these issues. So there's something about government being able to see the profession as having a credible voice. But there's also something about making a positive case for what regulation can do as well, that it isn't just red tape. It is enabling. It lifts standards. It protects citizens, consumers and businesses. And it's a foundation to the broader trust that exists between participants in an advanced economy and society.
Yeah. The government has launched, of course, a number of initiatives to try to improve and influence regulation, not least its Smarter Regulation Programme, which last year was set up to seek to reduce burdens on businesses and promote innovation and growth. We've had many initiatives down the line, the bonfire of red tapes, etc. I mean, is this latest Smarter Regulation Programme a good thing, and if so, why?
Well, reducing burdens is a good thing, of course, but you do need to do a cost-benefit analysis on whether reducing the burden is the right thing to do. For example, ensuring that medicines pass rigorous tests is clearly a burden, but it reduces harm from unintended side effects and it maintains trust that approved drugs actually work. You mentioned innovation and growth, and that's also double-edged. Innovation and growth are obviously a good thing, but to take the example of the Bank of England where I worked, you have to ask, what does it actually mean to say that innovation and growth should be pursued alongside a core objective of financial stability? Does that mean that you want to take more financial stability risk to increase the growth rate? Does it mean that a firm can more effectively lobby against or even challenge a regulatory decision on the basis that it harms their growth? And if you don't mean that, what exactly do you mean or want the bank to do about that? It's really important to be specific about those aspirations and not just to list out things that would be nice to achieve.
Right, yeah. So, clearly there's a lot going on, but specifically there's a call for evidence that's just been launched into strengthening the economic regulation of energy, water and the telecom sectors. What can we expect from that consultation?
I wouldn't expect radical institutional change at this point, particularly this close to a general election. I would expect some detail to emerge on the extension of the growth duty to utilities regulators, which is something that's already been decided in principle. And beyond that, I think there will be some effort to clarify which problems exist across utilities, such as the need to balance prices, security of supply and investment, and what is specific to particular fields. For instance, environmental protection looks quite different in water to what it does in energy. And where the challenges are common, I would expect an attempt to try and ensure they're thought about in a similar way.
Okay. The work also includes some post-Brexit regulatory reforms and, of course, ensuring that regulation is, as I think the quote is, the last resort, not a first choice. Do you agree that that's important? What would you like to see ultimately coming out of this review?
Of course, if regulation isn't needed, it shouldn't be imposed. And the review will identify areas in which regulation should be streamlined, and that's a good thing. But I don't think regulation should be a last resort. I think it should be thought of as a policy option to be evaluated case by case on its merits. the framing of a last resort implies that even if you had a different way of solving a problem, like, closing down an entire industry rather than regulating it, you would do that instead of imposing a regulation. Now, clearly that isn't what anyone actually means, but the language muddles people's reasoning around this, I think.
Or it makes it sound like it is a very, very negative thing.
Exactly. And in terms of what I'd like to see from the wider review, I think, I'd like to see some streamlining of regulation, yes, but particularly the processes of keeping regulation up to date post-Brexit. How are we going to handle the extra burdens that places on the UK regulatory system? I'd like to see clarity as to how the trade-off between the desire to ask regulators to do ever more through more complex objectives is going to be balanced against the difficulties that creates in managing regulatory organisations to those complex sets of objectives. And I would like to see clarity around the protections for and the perimeters around regulatory independence.
Great. Well, clearly, Matthew, 2024 is going to be dominated politically by the general election. Both the Tories and Labour are committed to regulatory reform, as I said earlier, strengthening in some areas, removing burden in others. How would you describe the regulatory party dividing lines? Are there any?
Yeah, it's complicated. Traditionally, you might say that the Conservative Party would be in favour of reducing burdens, cutting red tape. That would be the stereotype. But I think the debate is now much more nuanced than that. And there's disagreement even within the Conservative Party about the role that regulation can play. And as we've discussed, it's a very varied field of activity. I think whoever is in government after the election is going to be financially very squeezed. And so regulation will be of interest because they'll be looking to see how can we achieve policy objectives using levers that don't directly cost the government money. And that will raise questions like, when should regulators be levying fees or charging for licenses to fund programs of government work ultimately? Or when should the private or third sector be required to do things government wants doing in return for doing what it wants to do? So, for instance, requirements to provide social housing as a condition of planning permission. And I think we might see quite a bit more of that sort of thing. Okay,
and are there any potential regulatory pitfalls that might flow from a change of government or a refreshed administration?
I think the main risk is change for its own sake. You wouldn't want a government to come in and just sort of throw the regulatory landscape up in the air. And as we've discussed, regulation is something that needs to be thought about beyond the electoral time cycle. I think there's also a risk of trying to achieve too much politically through regulation, through the kind of mechanisms I've just described, because if you do that, then the regulatory process itself might come to seem politicised, and that could erode trust in regulators to act fairly. And if you get into that position, then that will be bad for everybody.
Great. Now, I suppose just to finish off with, how do you see the future of regulation? Is it a difficult period of revolution required or a gradual evolution towards some better outcomes?
As you would expect from what I've said, I'm a passionate gradualist on this, and it's very situation specific. There's a risk in talking too generally about regulation. I do think there is a real opportunity, though, to do what the Institute of Regulation is trying to do, which is to develop a more coherent professional regulatory community. And in that context, I guess I'd think of regulation as requiring a complex set of skills that can be learned and shared and then applied to bespoke work on a case-by-case basis, rather than something that we should be trying to make look the same everywhere that it's applied.
Brilliant. It's really interesting stuff, a really interesting time at the moment, Matthew, as I said. So thanks so much for joining me today on the Regulation Podcast and explaining this huge, complex subject. I think we made a start, though, in unpacking the challenges facing UK regulation and explaining how better regulation might actually start to deliver better government. So thanks so much for joining me today, Matthew.
Many thanks. It's good to speak to you.
Great. It is, I say, it's a very interesting time, a very important time for the whole regulation profession. So I found that a useful romp through the challenges. It's all we've got time for today, though. But in the meantime, we have got more regulation podcasts planned and more guests to talk to as we continue to get stuck into some of the big issues faced across the sector. If you haven't done so already, do check out the IOR website. That's www.ioregulation.org, where you'll find a huge amount of really useful information about the Institute, how you can get involved, and of course about the issues and challenges facing regulation. And of course you'll find details of all the podcasts we've run so far, and they'll be there for you to listen to and to share. So thanks for joining us today, and thanks again to Matthew, and on behalf of the Institute of Regulation, I look forward to seeing you again very soon.